Hey guys, it's M. I've honestly been meaning to make a video on the entirety of Elden Ring, but given everyone and their mom has already done that, I feel there's no reason for me to throw my hat in that ring too. In a sense, I wanted to talk about the bosses in Elden Ring and how I honestly feel about them. I know this is commonly talked about in those hour-long videos that people make, but let's get right into it since I don't want to waste time. Many people coming from previous Souls games say that the bosses delay too much, have unavoidable attacks, etc. Most of the newer people say it's about spacing, understanding where to roll, understanding what odd strats to use, leveling. Both want to give advice to the other or hate the other's playstyle, but really, half of the old players don't want to adjust to Elden Ring's new playstyle, and the newer ones don't seem to want to acknowledge the major differences and pretend that there's no reason for older fans to be rumpled over the changes. Elden Ring's bosses are designed functionally very different from the rest of the Soulsborne games. No one seems to like to talk about this fact, or at least acknowledge it in a way that I believe it is. Before I get super deep into this argument, let me give you my background so you know I'm not talking out of my ass. I've played every Souls game except Demon Souls, and I've played a few of the other Souls-like games made by other developers such as Remnant, Let It Die, Nioh, and quite a few more. I feel like I've seen all, if not enough, attempts to make bosses in this style to understand the differences between how these games handle bosses. Dark Souls bosses for the most part are based on mastery and understanding. Elden Ring's bosses are more based on RPG-ish and level-based combat than the Souls games previous. An argument I saw brought up against the old games is that you could hitless a boss if you knew all their moves and you could just roll through them, making it a turn-based system as they won't throw in any unexpected mix-ups like the Elden Ring bosses do, which makes the game simple and predictable when you get used to it. I've seen this mentioned like it's a bad thing, but it just isn't. The main reason Dark Souls combat works is because it's not necessarily over-complex. The games are really simple, but a lot of things work together to make them hard. Gale is a boss widely regarded as one of the best fights in the Dark Souls series. From his speed to the flashy attacks he does, he feels like a proper ending to the series to many. Once you learn all of his attacks, you could reliably hitless him if you're good enough. Your mastery from fighting and losing to him or just surviving his attack is rewarded by you just not getting hit by these attacks anymore. Long story short, this is rewarding. This feels good to accomplish. Knowing 3 or 4 hits from any of these attacks that you've learned could kill you, but you're so far beyond it, it's not a problem for you anymore. Every boss is designed like this. Some of the most iconic fights like Artorias, Manus, Gwyn, Gale, Gehrman, Orphan, all these bosses require you to pretty much master their combat in order to beat them, which is a really good feeling. Elden Ring doesn't fully function like this. Elden Ring has a bunch of finicky and gimmicky moves that'll sometimes randomly come out and not give you a chance to dodge them. Quoting this video here from Lupine 0, they state that every attack is reactable, and if you can't dodge them, it's basically just a skill issue. My main problem with this argument is a lot of moves are just nigh unreactable, if not undodgeable. They defended Godrick's Whirlwind move, which is pretty much a guaranteed hit if you're not far enough away from him. Their defense was this attack tries to put you in his comfortable range, and that he doesn't understand why people complained about it. The problem isn't that he gets you away from him, it's the fact that it's unreactable if you're in a certain range of him and you're forced to eat a hit. Gale technically has a move similar to this when he implodes, but this move is reactable. Ava from Dark Souls 2 has a move that makes him explode if you're close enough to him, but this is also reactable. He references Ludwig having a swipe, but this swipe is reactable, and especially since it's in Bloodborne where the combat's paced way faster. Godrick's goofy Whirlwind is pretty much guaranteed if you're close enough. Unlike everyone else who does a slow-ish explosion or a fast swipe, you cannot roll out of or through this Whirlwind depending on how close you are. This is the main issue people have with it, because it's guaranteed damage you wouldn't have to take in any other Souls game. In the same video, he goes on to mention that he thinks it's weird that people say Elden Ring fuels passivity, and that it's just a skill issue. I'll give you 2 examples of this game fueling passivity. First is the invisible boss. Their gimmick is that you have to hear them, or see their footsteps in the water and wait for them to attack. This fight literally forces you to be passive, but since it's only one example, I don't want to lean on it. Let's go on to one of my favorite bosses, Crucible Knight. Admittedly a basic fight, but fun I find nonetheless. I restarted the game on a different character and found this Evergal with a Crucible Knight in it. I functionally learned this fight in and out, and I can reliably beat him. I've learned his movements, some of his parry timings, and etc. Then he has this tail swipe. Is this move a problem in itself? No, of course not. It's really fast, so you'll have to get used to dodging it immediately when you see his ass light up, but other than that, it's fine in that regard. The problem is he can spam it non-stop if he wants to. One time I had him do this tail swipe so many times in a row, so fast, I ran out of stamina from dodging it and was forced to eat a hit. This sort of scenario never really happened to me in previous Souls games, except for maybe Fume Knight in Dark Souls 2 due to that game's slower stamina regeneration. And for my final example on passivity, I'm going to talk about Malenia. I know many people have many different opinions about Malenia, but I managed to beat her with Cestus, no Spirit, or Player Summon, so I feel like I can talk about her fairness since I've had a 1v1 fight with her. Malenia is a very aggressive boss. True, there are a lot of times where you can push her backwards and she can't do anything about it, but there's also a lot of times where you're forced to see what she's going to do first. First example is Waterfowl Dance. I know a lot of people say this move is undodgeable. It has a lot of problems. I still don't think that move is perfect, but that's nothing that we have to talk about today. The thing with the way I was fighting Malenia is I did a lot of jump attacks. Because with normal attacks, she's too fast, so if you go for like 1 or 2 swings with Cestus, she'll probably move and hit you before you get the second hit out. If you go for a jump attack and she decides to immediately go into Waterfowl, which is a thing she always has the option of doing, you're probably going to eat a good chunk of damage, if not just die. Waterfowl somewhat forces you to be passive around her because you have to watch for the moment she hits the air. Even with light armor, where they have this tactic where you roll back 3 times and then you roll into her to escape the whole move, if she does it early and you don't process what she's doing in time, you're going to either die or eat like 80% of your health bar. God forbid you're running medium or heavy armor, because your best tactic to avoid Waterfowl Dance is to just run away. And if you jump in and she decides to do it, you're so close you do not have the time to run away from this attack. So a lot of times you'll have to mash roll, and in most cases, die. Then there are her few armor moves. Malenia has 2 good moves that I can think of where she just can armor through whatever you're doing. One being her kick, which I will admit is pretty readable. And then there's her jumping sideways slash. If you jump in for a jump attack and she decides to do this move and you're not close enough to the ground, you just eat damage. You might possibly even eat a combo. So a lot of times you'll see me run up to Malenia, see if she's going to do something, and then do a weird little jump attack, because if I don't do that, I might eat half health. And then we get to talk about the fun of second phase, where Malenia's AI is on drugs and she will non-stop chase you for a good chunk of the fight. This can lead to a lot of situations where you'll run out of stamina, because she will unironically non-stop attack you. And especially since she has this new jumping spirit move that can hit you from like halfway across the screen, there's pretty much no way you'll get out of her range unless she lets you get out of her range. Even on the one attempt where I managed to beat her, she did so many attacks and then did Waterfowl, I ran out of stamina to fully dodge it, so I ate a good chunk of damage because I was trying to be aggressive and get some hits in. And do not get me started on Mohg's half health move. Lupine said that they enjoyed this move and they felt that it added a little bit of challenge and was different. This is subjective. I personally don't like it. There was never any move like this before in any of the games, and that's most likely why a lot of old Soul players don't like this move. They go on to say the reason Joseph Anderson, the person that his video was aimed to counter, complained about moves like Godric's Whirlwind, Margit's Force Slash, or any other boss that can do an unreactable or seemingly unexpected finishing attack, is because he'll see himself get punished 1 out of 10 times. He then goes on to say that it's Joseph's fault for not wanting to go on and take risks. This kind of mechanic just did not exist before. If a boss finished a string, they finish the string, and they just don't randomly throw in an extra attack, some of which turn into their own strings. The main reason Joseph Anderson finds it annoying is because the mastery reward you got from other games can randomly just not matter, because bosses will throw in an unexpected finisher or do their nigh unreactable moves. Or, in Mohg's case, you literally just have to eat the hit unless you find a random shackle somewhere. I understand that Lupine goes to argue this by saying if you get that shackle, you don't have to eat the necessary damage that Mohg does, but there was never an item that you needed to stop a boss from doing an undodgeable attack. The closest thing that you can compare this to is Gascoigne, but even then, all Gascoigne's music box did was stun him for a little bit. It wouldn't stop him from doing some unreactable grab where he tears your head off. Stuff like this is the main reason backing off and passivity is so effective in Elden Ring, because while the boss is mashing attacks, you can just run away and heal in safety. For example, Godric's flail attack, where he just madly swings at you. A, you could sit down and learn how to dodge the whole thing, then heal or attack, wasting 80% of your stamina trying to do so. Or B, you can run away, get most of your stamina back, and heal while he's flailing, and you're in a safe space. There's a dominant option here. There aren't really too many bosses that this feels viable towards in previous titles, because the strings weren't as long as they are in Elden Ring. I'm not saying that you can't run away and get a cheeky heal in those games, especially in Dark Souls 1, given a lot of their clunkier natures. I'm just saying it's far more common, more dominant, and easier to get away with in Elden Ring than most of those other titles. Then there's the entire factor of Elden Ring's build diversity. Your build will greatly affect how you deal with situations in this game. Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 pretty much have the same sort of design philosophy, where in a normal playthrough, your build won't change too much about how you fight the bosses. In 3, magic was heavily nerfed, so unless you're going out of your way to specifically use it, you're pretty much going to buff your weapon, maybe get a few range moves off before getting close and then whacking them like every other build. Dark Souls 1 had less intense balancing given that it was technically their second game in this genre, but even though magic damage was higher back then, unless you're going out of your way, it's pretty much the same story. 2 went for more of an RPG type leveling system similar to Elden Ring. There are a good few bosses you may be able to pick out from range, especially with the introduction of the weeds that restore cast, but even then, it's not to the same extent as Elden Ring. Elden Ring will literally let you do whatever you want. This leads to some bosses being actual garbage by the time you fight them, or in the way you fight them. For example, one playthrough I had of VR, I accidentally skipped both Margit and Godric. When I came back, I fucking destroyed them because I was so overleveled my attacks annihilated them. I have a friend who I asked for tips on how to beat Mode, commonly regarded as one of the more annoying bosses of the game. He had a bleed build with Eleanor's blade, and then he told me he's easy and that he killed him so fast he died in phase 1. He had never seen the infamous half-health nil attack or any of Mohg's second phase. This kind of thing just didn't happen in previous games. If you fought Badir, you've seen his second phase transformation. If you fought Gale, you've seen his second and third phase. My friend juiced Mohg so fast there wasn't even a chance for this to happen. Same can be said for the Knight and Flamesword and the Rivers of Blood. I'm sure many players kill bosses so fast they don't even know half of their moveset. This is what set most old Souls fans off. The fact that mastery has been replaced by leveling and weapon choice, and that it feels like the dominant strategy by far. Let's take a look at an old mechanic. Parrying. Parrying felt like the peak of old Souls games, specifically the trilogy. It was the one thing most players looked at and went, God, I wish I knew how to do that. It did a ton of damage, looked cool, and was pretty hard to do. Pretty much the ultimate payoff for your mastery at the end of those games. They did so much damage that if you learned them, they were pretty much the dominant strategy. In Elden Ring, if someone with an intelligence build was at the same level as someone parrying a boss perfectly in a speedrunning competition, the ranged magic build would win. The person with less experience and is only getting space and shooting an orb would easily beat the boss faster than the guy who's perfectly learned the boss. This was just not a thing before in Souls games. Mastery doesn't equal much anymore. Since the options have been opened up so much, there's easier and more effective ways to beat the boss than just being good at the game. If this same guy who learned how to perfectly parry the bosses had the speedrun against a fairly average player using the Dark Knife Teach Spirit Summon, it would be no contest since that Spirit Summon is so strong. And don't get me started on Rivers of Blood or Night and Flame. Most people would try to counter my argument with the they've been nerfed argument, but a massive chunk of Elden Ring's player base beat it once and then dropped the game. It's been months since the game's release, and most people are going to have experiences with those weapons and still refer to those when they were used pre-patch. The entire get good mentality that most of the old Dark Souls games had has just been replaced by the get decent and then level up a little bit mentality, neither of which are a bad thing. These games' bosses are not one-to-one like many like to pretend. Neither of these opinions on bosses are apparently wrong or why to like or dislike them, but it's so different from what previous games taught you that it feels off to older players, as the way FromSoft educated them to play their games doesn't match with what Elden Ring is in 99% of cases. So I don't know why people like to make rants on how one side's being idiotic when neither side, from what I've personally heard, wants to acknowledge anything changing other than the fact of, hey, this one move is a little quirky. To wrap up, I want to talk about one of the best fights in the series in my opinion, Godfrey. One of the more higher regarded bosses from both sides from what I've heard at least. This boss is a mastery boss in most cases. If you're ranged, when he activates Super Stomp mode, you can't just mash ranged attacks as he'll knock you out of most of them if not just chase you. His delayed attacks don't ever change in timing, so once you learn them, you can counter them appropriately. His openings aren't too long, but they're just long enough where you can squeeze a hit or two in. You can counter and create your own openings in his stomps with your jump attack, and he feels like the perfectly balanced boss. Even his second phase, which some regard as feral and nigh impossible to fully deal with, can be learned if you really want to. And unlike most Elden Ring bosses where the counter's obtuse like, for Millennia's waterfowl dance, roll left then right, or you know you can throw a firebomb at her to interrupt Rot Bloom, The most irritating attack he has is a rush, where if you just look at him, you can tell you can either run away or roll behind him. And this is the only iffy move he has. The only other really fair Godfrey-like fight in my opinion is the Crucible Knight, which is partially why I enjoy his fight so much now. I personally enjoy the reward for mastery more than straight leveling and exploring. I feel many people agree with me and many people disagree with me on that point. A good chunk of the fan base enjoys one thing, and since Elden Ring's player base is literally ginormous, a lot of them enjoy Elden Rings. We can accept our differences without pretending both cases are exactly the same and move on. With that, I've said my piece. I've been in, and I am out.